don't know what's actually out there and you can hear things coming towards you, that's when your mind starts playing tricks with you and you're like, I'm not sure what that is. It sounds terrifying. I'm just gonna go back to the dock to try and save myself. And then you're like, wait, where am I? How do I actually save myself anymore? So to come up with this whole unfathomable depth sort of look that we had with Dredge, as far as like how the depths of the water just feels like it goes down for like forever. Or when you go out into the ocean and you start swimming, you can never really see more than a couple meters in front of you, and then just like what's below there. And I think that's a really big part of what kind of brings some of that fear and atmosphere into Dredge. My workflow for 3D assets usually starts off with doing some really rough base meshes inside of Maya. And then I tend to just jump straight into ZBrush, and then I will pretty much just sculpt those creatures out and then do a lot of those blocking out textures and everything there, and then retopologize back in Maya. But in recent times, I've started switching over to Blender of all things, mainly because our other artists are more familiar using that tool, and then it just makes it easier for kind of just jumping around in the same tools. The 2D artist, he tends to paint by just using the lasso tool. So he does some wizardry and he just draws out big shapes and then turns them and sculpts them basically into what the characters look like. And then I ended up just liking that sort of art style so much that I've started adopting that just into my normal sort of approach to texturing characters anyway. It just has this nice, clean, sharp look, which is really cool. We decided to go with that low poly art style as more of a kind of constraint with how much time that we had to go with, because we were kind of like going with the prototypes and then just iterating on top of that prototype work that we're working on. And it's actually deceptively high poly in some areas just because we wanted to go with the sort of sharp, clean look of the 2D art. And then so we went with the low poly style because it's also got those sharp, clean edges. But to get some of that textural detail, we actually had to just model that detail in and then texture it that way to kind of get those sharp edges so it doesn't really blur when you get like some of those larger creatures on. When it came to some of the actual creatures, because we found out that that sort of fade off distance would hide most of the creature, so we had to have some kind of shader solutions that kind of made that monster also kind of fade off at a slightly different distance, so you could still see them kind of like emerging from the depths. We've got like something in the shader that kind of like blurs out and just kind of fades out all that sort of detail that's below a certain depth, and we can control that using the water shader. Let's take a look at the water shader we created for Dredge. First, I'm going to open up the water shader and show you how everything looks like from a high level. As you can see, it's pretty messy, it's a bit big, there's a lot of things going on, but we'll be able to work with it well enough. Now let's open up this texture here. This is our wave mask texture. It's the single largest texture in the game, but it contains a lot of information in all the different channels. So we've got like the red channel, which has a bunch of information, the blue, the green, and the alpha channel. And all of these things have a bunch of different calculations that we use for our water shader. And then these sort of calculations are used for a lot of the actual gameplay information that we feed through the game. For example, these control where players can see water ripples in the game and can determine where fog can actually reach, so players can see distant objects like docks more clearly. We also do some calculations that check the depth, which is where we kind of figure out where different types of crabs can actually be found, as well as some of the different types of fish. And this can be really helpful for figuring out all those sort of things. Creating the water shader itself, this spaghetti node monster required a lot of trial and error, and we actually kept some of these errors in because they actually looked more visually interesting and were more aligned with our art direction than when they were actually done properly. We even started out using the Gerstner wave solution for our water physics, but ended up going with a sine wave approach because while the Gerstner waves looked more realistic, they weren't really a good fit for our gameplay and aesthetics. They also had the unfortunate side effect of turning most of our waves into ramps, which launched the boat into the sky. So going with the sine wave led to a much better gameplay experience overall. Probably the biggest challenge was one of the Leviathan creatures, because it's just such a gigantic creature in the game, and that was when we really had to commit to doing that whole sharp-edged, sort of low poly or low texture size assets, because when we had a closer look at the creature, when you're close up to the creature with the normal texturing approach, the things started getting really blurry. And then so that's why we had to model in all of those details where all those textures would kind of sit. From those challenges, I kind of really liked that style. I'd say the biggest time saver that we did was pretty much going with like the smaller gradient map texture blocks, because they were usually around about very small texture sizes, 64 by 64, 128 by 128. And then we use that for pretty much texturing everything within a particular biome. So all the buildings and most of the creatures would pretty much use a single texture sheet, and then that would just save us time from having to make multiple different textures. A lot of the sort of effects and visuals that we kind of put into the game were to kind of obscure vision or kind of create this atmosphere. I think one of the biggest things that we did was the use of the fog. So we had our own solution for creating the fog. And the idea was that you can't really see too much further from your actual boat. And it was that kind of fear of what's just a little bit beyond your actual sight that was what was really creating a lot of fear for the players. A couple of extra things that we did to kind of bring in that sort of atmosphere and dread was at night we actually kind of remove a lot of the audio. There's no music that ever plays, and it's all about that sort of atmosphere. And all you can really hear is just like a slight creaking of the boat or just the waves up against the boat just hitting it. And then eventually you'll just hear a creepy monster stinger, and then that's just like, oh, everything's silent, now I'm hearing something, what do I do, what do I do? And it's just those small things. It's not adding things, it's almost like remove a lot of things, and that's what really makes fear. Just let people's minds take control.